Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Bruce Baumgarten, and I've been asked by ACP to coordinate and to host these events on behalf of the board of ACP and its executive director, Therese Brown. I bid you good afternoon or good morning, depending on what part of God's good earth you are standing. A few housekeeping details. As is standard with webinars, the participant audio and video is muted, so all the resources can be directed toward the presenter. I will mute my own audio and video as well. You are welcome to use the GoToWebinar control panel to chat amongst yourselves and with me during the presentation. Some folks like to multitask, others just like to absorb, but there's one of the little selections in the control panel says chat, so you can use that to chat amongst yourselves. There is another one that says questions. That is best to use if you want to address some questions to me, because I can answer them just in text right there. But then you can use the chat panel also to post some questions for John, and he will be taking some questions after the presentation's concluded. We'll have time for a short Q&A after the presentation. I'll read the questions at that time and feed them to our speaker for the response. After the completion of the webinar, when it signs off, the GoToWebinar page will automatically load a short evaluation form. Please take a moment to complete this so we can constantly improve our product. A special thank you for understanding our last-minute change of plans. Our previously scheduled speaker was unable to make it, but we are delighted and deeply, deeply appreciative to John Davis for most ably heeding the call. And now to John. John Davis is a journalist, author, and speaker specializing in Vatican and religious affairs. He is known in the trade as a Vaticanista, having covered Vatican events for 35 years. He was a Rome bureau chief for Catholic News Service and served 3 years as president of the Association of International Journalists accredited to the Vatican, the only American ever elected to that post. He has won numerous journalistic awards and has lectured on Vatican affairs in the United States and Europe. In 2013, his book, The Vatican Diaries, a behind-the-scenes look at the power, personalities, and politics at the heart of the Catholic Church, became a New York Times bestseller. And his second book, The Vatican Prophecies, Investigating Supernatural Signs, Apparitions, and Miracles in the Modern Age, was published by Viking in 2015. Ladies and gentlemen, give me one moment to click a few things, and we will happily welcome John Davis. So, and John, let's see, are you online?
I should be.
Yep, there you are. And you should be able to share your screen with that little button we did before.
Okay. Let's see if I see a little button.
Okay, yeah, you should be able to get the button.
Okay.
Perfect.
Great. Are we rolling?
We are.
Okay, very good.
And I will shut up.
Thank you all. Thank you, Bruce, for the introduction, and thank you all. Wherever you are, I can't see you. You can see me, presumably. I'll start by pointing out, as Bruce did, that I'm not a publisher. I am, however, a journalist, a writer, and a commentator on Catholic affairs, and I try to observe pretty closely the changes in the Catholic Church, including the demographic changes. And they've been huge just in my lifetime, as we'll see. Demographics, you know, it's crucially important for the Catholic Church. It always has been, but especially now, I think, in the age of globalization and multiculturalism. Demographics is changing more rapidly than ever before. And of course, this is crucial for Catholic publishing, for all publishing as well. You have to know your markets. And today, more than ever, I think the Catholic market for published materials is diverse and changing. Demographics impacts the Church at the local and universal levels. I want to start by looking at the local level, particularly with the Catholic parish. Now, reliable statistics on Catholic population, believe it or not, are not always easy to come by. They're often based on surveys, which may have a fairly wide margin of error. I will note, just starting out here, that according to church officials, and this is something the Vatican does keep very close track of, the Catholic population in the United States has grown pretty consistently in recent decades, and today numbers about 70 million people. And that is good news. It represents an incredibly large potential audience for publishing. I know that for many publishers, the health of parish life in this country has a big impact on their business. There are direct sales to parishes. In some cases, there are sales now through parishes. Obviously, the parish is where liturgy happens. It's where catechesis happens. More generally, parishes are places where books and ideas are discussed, where I think a Catholic culture and a Catholic leadership network develops. The parish is a place where people share what they're reading about spirituality, liturgy, scripture, what have you. Now, it will be no surprise to you that the trends in Catholic parishes are not entirely encouraging. I won't review all the statistics, but studies have indicated a significant decline in regular Mass attendance and participation in the sacraments over the last 50 years, especially among the young. This is the main result of a study done by CARA, the Center for Applied Research in the Apostolate. The data on the right is from 2008. It found that 23% of US Catholics were weekly Mass goers. And they updated that study last year, those 2016 numbers. They were pretty much unchanged. The number dropped slightly, but it's within a margin of error. That same CARA survey last year found that today a majority of self-identified Catholics are not parish affiliated. I mean, if you look at the charts, you will see that the majority today goes to their local church a few times a year or less often. They attend Mass on Ash Wednesday, Easter, Christmas, or even not as often as that. The far right column, of course, is the big concern here, the millennials. If you look at that, you'll see that 2/3 of them are infrequent Mass attenders. These are self-identified Catholics, by the way. Only 14% of these millennial Catholics attend weekly. Now, as we know, millennials are the digital generation. They're less likely to join brick and mortar institutions like parishes, and therefore less likely to encounter the published works that have traditionally reached Catholics through the parish. And all this challenges publishers to create, I think, new channels of marketing and communication, especially with younger people. There is no longer a huge captive audience in the parish. And that means publishers are having to go to websites, blogs, the wider media for advertising, to church encounters like World Youth Day for young people. The Catholic population is aging, and pretty rapidly. This is a Pew survey from 2015 that showed, if you see here, the statistics from 2007 showed the median age of adults. For Catholics, it was 45. 7 years later, it jumped to 49. That's the largest jump among all these groups. And this, of course, has a particular impact on publishing, because it means that the audience for traditional media is contracting. Here is another aspect of changing Catholic demographics. According to this Pew study of 2015, Catholicism has experienced the greatest net losses due to religious switching. Nearly a third of all US Catholics, about 32%, that's right here, were raised Catholic, and most of them continue to identify as Catholics today. But nearly 13% of all Americans are former Catholics, people who no longer identify with the faith, despite having been raised in the Catholic Church. Okay? By comparison, there are far fewer converts to Catholicism, those entering the group. 2% of all US adults now identify as Catholics after having been raised in another religion or without a religion or another church. The bottom line here is that there are 6 former Catholics for every convert to Catholicism. You see that on the bottom line right here. It actually is the bottom line, and it's not a very happy one. I'll point to another internal demographic fact that impacts parish life. There's been a drastic decline in the number of diocesan priests. There were approximately 34,000 priests in 1990, and there were about 16,000 in 2015. That has left, pardon me, I'll go back. That has left, as we see here, about 3,500 parishes without a resident priest. At the same time, there has been a huge increase in lay ministers who today far outnumber diocesan priests. Okay, and if we're talking about big changes in demographics, obviously we have the well-known trend of the shifting US Catholic population, Northeast and Midwest to the South and West. So this chart from Cara shows the extent of this shift between 1950 and 2008. And as you can see, the South and West, which were a very small part of the pie in 1950, are about half of that in 2008. That was 2008. Well, since then, the trend has continued. According to the Pew study I referenced earlier, between 2007 and 2014, the shares of US Catholics living in the Northeast and the Midwest continued to fall by another 3 percentage points. And the shares living in the South and West have each increased by 3 points. So as you can see here today, Catholics are relatively evenly distributed across the country. Now, this is not a bad thing. Maybe it's a good thing. But it means that, of course, publishers are seeing a market that is shifting, that is more mobile, that is harder to reach through the traditional channels. And it has also brought with it a lag in the way parish structures have changed. The shift in parish structures has fallen behind the shift in population. We can see by this CARA chart that, I believe this is again from 2014, at that time, in the Northeast and Midwest, you had still 65%. That's where 65% of US parishes were found, although many of them are closing or merging. At the same time, many parish structures in the South and West today are hard-pressed to keep up with the increase in membership. They're overflowing, but they don't have the structures. The largest local parishes in terms of numbers of Catholics are now in the Western United States. That's the purple bar, okay? And that, of course, is a big change from 40 years ago. By the way, this last development, it's not just a US issue. It's a global issue for the Catholic Church. Across the world, there is a dramatic demographic realignment going on because of very different growth patterns. Europe, where growth is little or none today, in fact, we've seen a decrease in numbers, where most Catholics don't go to church there anyway, is full of parishes and structures. Africa, where the church is booming, is not. And I'll talk more about that in a little while. Here's another trend affecting parishes. On the whole, in part because of immigration, Catholic parishes in the United States are becoming more culturally and linguistically diverse, as well as more geographically dispersed. So we all know that Hispanic Catholics now constitute about 33% of all US Catholics. As of 2014, more than a quarter of US adult Catholics were born outside the country. That's 27% of US adult Catholics were born outside the United States. The Pew study of 2015 showed that Catholics in the United States were far more likely than the general population to be Hispanic. You can see that here. And a CARA analysis shows, this is interesting, that the younger the Catholic population, the greater the ethnic and racial diversity. So when we get to the millennials, we see 44% Hispanic Latino. So obviously, this trend is the church's future as well. It's not just something, a phase where we've gone through. It's going to continue. I would note here that certainly we are seeing more Spanish language publications in this country. And the Latino Catholic population, in theory, I think represents a huge new market. But from what I'm told, there are some built-in problems there. For one thing, of course, there are added costs and time in doing translations for publishers who are not creating Spanish language content. For another thing, according to surveys, Hispanics as an ethnic group read fewer books. This is, again, a Pew survey from 2016, I believe. And it shows here that it's a general population, US adults who said they have read a book in the previous 12 months, 58% among Hispanics, which is, of course, much lower than the total population of 73%. Please note, I'm not saying that because they're Hispanic, they're not reading books. there are many other factors that come into play, including economics, availability, the resources available to Hispanic readers. A third factor, I think, in the whole Spanish language publication issue is that the language issue is complicated. In many Latino families, older members, for example, may speak Spanish while the younger members are rapidly transitioning to English. I want to come around to another important or interesting fact, and that is about 1/4 of U.S. diocesan priests today come from foreign countries, okay? And with it, they bring other languages as well. My hometown parish in Minnesota, for example, which was founded by Jesuits and managed by them for about 150 years, is now run by priests from Argentina. Obviously, they say Mass in English, but they also speak Spanish, and there's a small Spanish population in southern Minnesota. Diversity and mobility, these are the hallmarks of our modern culture and our modern church. Along with this, I think parish shopping has increased dramatically, with people driving sometimes many miles to attend church and passing over parishes closer to home. The territorial parish is not what it used to be. And this raises the question, is the parochial structure that people like myself grew up with, in other words, a center that includes parish, Catholic school, a rectory, an adjacent convent perhaps, is that going to be the structure of the future? And this is a question not only for publishers, but for the entire church. And I do think that the future of the parish will be a key topic for Pope Francis and the Vatican over the next few years. Now, the Pope has already outlined some of his concerns about the parish in his apostolic letter, Evangelii Gaudium, the joy of the gospel. It's interesting what he said. He said the parish is not an outdated institution precisely because it possesses great flexibility. It can assume quite different contours depending on the openness and missionary creativity of the pastor and the community. Now, the Pope went on to say right after that up to now, our parishes are not doing a good enough job. He said, we're not making these parishes environments of participation, and we're not making them mission-oriented. So I think we will soon see these issues addressed in a formal and global way, perhaps in a synod of bishops. And I think Catholic publishers will want to pay close attention. And I think perhaps if such a meeting is called, they'll want to participate. Note that the Pope doesn't want to do away with the parish, which has proven to be quite resilient over the centuries. That's true in many parts of the United States. Surveys show, for example, that most Catholics who do participate are very attached to their parishes and their pastors. But I think it's much more difficult for today's pastors to have the time, resources, and training to be spiritual guides for individuals or groups. Now, how does all that affect the publishing world? Well, I think parishes have been the fundamental nexus of Catholic culture, and books and magazines have traditionally been a big part of that culture. So if that is weakening, yes, it presents a challenge, especially to the publishers who have provided parishes with worship aids, with catechetical material, music books, and other resources. I think in some ways the parish has acted as a kind of oasis away from the everyday pressures of the world, the very hectic pace of life, a place where vertical rather than horizontal experience can occur. That may be changing. As the parish diminishes as the center of Catholic spiritual life, we often see individuals seeking their own spiritual path. And this, of course, can lead in many directions. Hopefully, it will lead them to books. This leads me to my second point. I want to zero in on demographic trends among younger people and younger Catholics. Now, as you may know, the next year, 2018, bishops from around the world will gather in Rome for a synod that will focus on the church's outreach to young people. A synod is a very big event. I think many church leaders see this as outreach to young people, that is, as the #1 challenge on their horizon. And I think probably publishers could say the same. The drop-off of participation in and identification with the Catholic Church among young people is very real and serious. As we saw earlier, the most recent surveys show that in the United States, millennials, up here, born between 1981 and 1996, are less likely than members of older generational cohorts to identify as Catholic by religion. So here we have Catholics, and as you can see, the older generations, considerably Catholic. It doesn't change much for the so-called silent generation. Not sure why they're called silent. Baby boomers, that's me, also called in church parlance the Vatican II generation. Generation X, and then we hit millennials, and just between 2007 and 2014, there has been a very sharp drop-off. Millennial identification as Catholics among the general population is now 16%. Okay. 33% of millennials in the United States, and actually it's, if you include the group 18 to 29, it's even higher, it's almost 40%, identify as belonging to no religion. Okay, they are the famous nuns. Let me go back here and show you this. Here are the people who are unaffiliated, who do not identify with any religion. And again, the jump between 2007 among millennials and 2014 is huge. We're up to 35 or 36%. So any way you look at it, the generational replacement level for church membership has dropped sharply. This Pew study talks about, again, the replacement level here, 16%. And that's low. That's too low. Pew also found that younger Catholics are much more likely than older Catholics to say that they could imagine leaving the Catholic Church someday. 41% of Catholic adults under the age of 30 said they could envision themselves leaving the church, compared with about a quarter of those aged 30 to 64 and only 14% of those aged 65 and older. Modern Catholics, young Catholics in particular, are likely to receive the most information about their own religion and their own church through electronic and social media. This probably comes as no surprise to many of you. Now, it's a development that's opened up great opportunities in communication, okay? The Vatican's hopped on this digital bandwagon big time. I mean, even Pope Benedict had a Twitter account. Now, Pope Francis's Twitter account, just yesterday they announced it went over 40 million followers. I think he has 7 languages, so it's 14 million followers, as we can see here in English. Social media have created certainly opportunities for building connections between people, but they have made local parishes and dioceses less likely to be the source of information or the place where ideas are exchanged. And they have made printed materials less likely to be the medium used by younger Catholics. This is a a study done by the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism last year. And you can see, again, millennials are the darkest column. 64% of them get the main source of news is online, including social media. Social media alone, 33%. And not much TV and very little print and radio. Okay. And I don't think Catholic young people are any different. I think they certainly would follow this trend. Here they are. I think this is a group of young people waiting for Pope Francis to arrive in New York. And of course, you know, every single one of them was on their cell phones and getting ready to do a selfie and exchanging tons of information. So again, social media have created opportunities. We've seen though that the decline in print media, we've seen the decline of the Catholic newspaper, certainly. I'm sure it affects periodicals and books as well. Social media have a real foothold today, and in the future, I think it's going to dominate the flow of information in the church. I'm talking about websites, blogs, Twitter and Facebook, YouTube, even Instagram. They offer Catholics a chance to participate virtually in the life of the church. Yes, perhaps as cultural Catholics who physically attend Mass less than regularly, but that may well be the dominant model of the future. I'll make the rather obvious point here that paper products become less important in this electronic culture. Magazines and books can go online, but as we know, digital publishers face the fact that there is such a wide choice of online information that is free, and that Google searches are now the default way many people get their information, including Catholics. So, for example, it becomes much harder, I think, for magazines to develop long-term relationships with paying subscribers, given these multiple offerings online. Certainly the move to digital products is one of the biggest transformations happening in publishing today, in Catholic publishing as well. But as well as challenges, I think there are opportunities here. I mean, I'm sure you know, print products can be combined with digital products. Digital printing allows publishers to customize products for various locations or age groups, or groups within the church, or parish groups, or dioceses. And to combine these printed products with, or printable products, with online resources. I think that for the younger Catholic demographic, the key is to first find ways to adapt traditional content to the new media, and second, to educate young people in online, I guess I'd call it quality control, to teach them how to evaluate content and sources. Now, this is something that is on the Vatican's collective mind. It has been for years, and just this week, Pope Francis announced that he has chosen fake news as the theme of next year's World Communications Day. And I think Catholic publishers would be wise to promote this topic as a way to distinguish their own content, okay? I think this trend toward digital among younger generations, younger demographic groups, also says something about not just how they read, but how they participate in the life of the church. I'm talking really here about the sense of belonging to a cohesive group. Now, this is what follows is my own impression. I don't have a study to back it up, but I think many younger Catholics are more inclined to experience the church at a distance and not in the community. They are aware of Pope Francis, as we all are, and they may see something online about what he said or did, and agree with it and think, boy, he's great, count me in. But, you know, that kind of participation is not the week in, week out participation of parish life or sacramental life. It's more akin to the Facebook like than conversion. They may identify with the Pope or something that he wrote, a headline they caught online, a position on immigration or ecology, but not really identify with the church, locally or universally. There is less interaction with pastoral ministers. Now, in the past, these ministers were people who, among other things, led Catholics to publications. Nowadays, instead of a priest or a teacher guiding a person to a book, it's more likely to be an online algorithm popping up with a recommendation based on your Google searches. But there's another trend among young people, a somewhat surprising one, and of particular interest to all publishers. Young people, it turns out, do read, and they read books more than older generations. According to, again, a recent Pew Research Center survey on book reading, 18 to 29-year-olds are the age group most likely to have read a book in any format over the past year. More than 80% have done so, compared to 73% of those aged 30 to 49, 70% of those 50 to 64, 67% of those 65 or older. Millennials, it turns out, read for many reasons. They read for work or school, for pleasure. Again, millennials are the dark bar here. They read to keep up with current events, and especially they read on specific topics of interest, which should be good news for Catholic publishers, because Catholic publishing is still kind of a niche market and still focuses on very specific topics. It turns out young people also read books on cell phones. 22% of those aged 18 to 29 read ebooks on their cell phones. I can't imagine that, but go figure. It's actually good news. So my point is, if you can engage them, that's Stanley Rother, and I will explain his picture in a moment. If you can engage them, the young readers are there. I think that increasingly what engages young Catholics are positive stories, stories of hope, stories of faith lived in heroic fashion, of the spirituality as practiced by saints, like St. Teresa of Lisieux. Books on her continue to be bestsellers. Or the social justice commitment of people like Dorothy Day, or, as we see here, Father Stanley Rother, a missionary from Oklahoma who was martyred in Guatemala and recently beatified. We're all aware that millennials, the vast majority of them, travel under the label spiritual but not religious. I think there is a huge market for the spiritual and not religious crowd, and I think that the Church's vast history of spiritual writings, plus its modern spiritual writings, could respond to that market. I think one area where the Church faces a problem with young readers is in this widely perceived gap between science and the Catholic faith. This is something I think Church leadership has to work on. Sometimes I think science is the religion of many young people today, and with it the idea that if something can't be proven experimentally, well, it's not real. Therefore, belief in God is essentially a fairy tale people tell themselves. It is, of course, a complex topic, the relationship between science and faith. But I just want to say that I think there is a very ripe area for publishers to explore here, because there's a lot of ignorance out there, but there's also a large potential appetite for books that explore that relationship, science and faith, particularly in areas like cosmology and ecology. There's also a whole new genre of books being written about the relationship between quantum physics, consciousness, and belief in God. And here too, I think the field is wide open for Catholic publishers. When we talk about the younger Catholic demographic, we inevitably talk about education. I think Catholic publishing relies to a great degree on knowledge of and interest in the faith. Often the more you learn about theology or church history or spirituality or Christian morality, the more you dig deeper. And one of the challenges of today is that even the fundamental knowledge, the knowledge that would spur greater interest, is missing. A Pew Forum study in 2010 performed among the general population. It measured Americans' knowledge of their own belief systems and the belief systems of others. The survey asked questions such as, what is the first book of the Bible? Catholics, by the way, did not do very well. Atheists and agnostics performed the best. You can see here they averaged about 21 of 32 questions correctly. They answered 21 questions correctly. Jews and Mormons were close behind, scoring about 20 correct answers. Protestants as a whole got about 15. Catholics were last. Here they separated white Catholic and Hispanic Catholic. Catholics as a whole scored just under 15 correct answers. That's fewer than half. And I'm not talking about the fine points of canon law here. Only 55% of Catholics knew that the Church teaches that during Mass, the bread and wine becomes the body and blood of Christ. 55% of Catholics answered that correctly. Only 42% of Catholics were able to name Genesis as the first book of the Bible. Well, Catholics have never been that gung-ho about the Bible, so okay. I guess it is good that 87% of Catholics knew that Mother Teresa was a Catholic. One possible cause of this, I think, is that fewer young people are being educated today in Catholic schools. Enrollment in U.S. Catholic primary and secondary schools, and that is what these figures refer to, enrollment has steadily dropped from its peak of 5.2 million students 40 years ago. Today it's under 2 million students. Back in 1965, about half of all Catholic children in America attended Catholic elementary schools, according to the National Catholic Educational Association. And the yellow line here shows the elementary drop, secondary drop here. Again, we're now down to 1.8 million total students between both groups. Catholic schools were where many of us received Catholic culture. A recent study by CARA, again, the Center for Applied Research in the Apostolate, showed that the number of younger U.S. Catholics who had never been enrolled in Catholic education or participated in youth ministry is now 42%. 42% have never really had any contact with Catholic education, compared to 23% in my generation. So this is a real and lasting trend in our church today in the United States. It does go a long way, I think, in explaining the weakened knowledge of the faith and the weaker sense of Catholic identity among younger people. It probably translates into dim prospects for recovering the institutional buyers in parishes that some Catholic publishers have relied on for decades, especially in textbook and catechetical publications. Now, in Catholic higher educational institutions, the picture is better. Enrollment in Catholic colleges and universities has risen to about 800,000. But the number of Catholics among those enrolling is going down. This photo is actually from the University of Dayton, a Catholic college. It shows Muslim students, and Muslim students are increasingly part of the Catholic higher educational student body. I want to shift gears and talk about the demographic changes in the wider universal church now, because that also affects how we live Christianity in this country, and I think it impacts publishing too. This is arguably the most important change on the horizon, the Catholic Church's center of gravity shifting from north to south, from Europe and Latin America, from Europe and North America to Latin America, Asia, and especially Africa. Again, Pew Research has given us this wonderful chart. And you can see here Europe in 1910 representing almost 2/3 of the Catholic population. 2010, 24%. Big piece of the pie is Latin America. But look at Africa. Sub-Saharan Africa, which is, you can barely see here, has grown to 16%. North America has grown too, but not by as much as Africa. The number of Catholics in Africa, and I remember writing about this every single year whenever the Vatican released statistics, number of Catholics in Africa has skyrocketed over the last 50 years. Today, in 2017, it has reached about 200 million. Remember, these figures are from 2010. 2017, we're already up to 200 million, which is far more Catholics than in, obviously, North America. According to projections, by the middle of this century, Africa will have more than 1 billion Catholics. I'm sorry, more than 1 billion Christians. Nearly half of them Catholics, so 500 million Catholics, which would make it, no doubt, the largest Catholic continent at that time. We are seeing here the universalization of the church. And with it, more universal issues are coming to the forefront. We're seeing the church's demographic shift influencing the pastoral and social agenda coming from Rome. Under Pope Francis, the Vatican is relocating its focus from internal doctrine and identity politics of previous decades and previous popes to some very real and very practical issues that affect the world's Catholics every day. Now, this is important because when Rome acts, inevitably a certain ferment follows in Catholic publishing. Remember that under John Paul II, we had the project to devise a new catechism of the Catholic Church, which became, as we know, a global bestseller and the most widely sold catechetical work in recent times. By the way, the Pope just gave a speech today in which he said he wants the catechism updated to include the Church's stronger teaching on the death penalty. So good news for some publishers, we're going to get another revision of the Catechism of the Catholic Church, and I'm sure the Vatican will advise people to throw out the old copies. We've also had important doctrinal documents in recent decades on topics like liberation theology, which again stimulated a great number of published works. Another example, after the Vatican allowed access to some of its archive materials on Nazi Germany and World War II, we saw an explosion of books on those topics. We've had hundreds of new saints and their biographies, the theology of the body. We had John Paul II as author, who wrote bestsellers. We had Pope Benedict as author, who wrote a 3-part Jesus of Nazareth series and other works, book-length interviews with popes and other leading figures at the Vatican. We had Liturgiam Authenticum, which gave rise to a great debate and many works about the liturgy. Now, not all these topics are going out the window, but we are seeing Rome's agenda reflect to a much greater degree the concerns of the changing Catholic population in the world. It is more focused on the Church's social teaching. Climate change, for example, with the Pope leading the way with his own encyclical. Once the Pope published Laudato Si, I saw a number of study guides come on the market, interpretive commentaries. We're seeing, among the other new issues that's generating interest in Rome and studies in Rome and conferences in Rome, the right to water, economic injustice and exploitation. The Pope has focused problems facing ordinary families, discrimination and persecution of Christians in some areas of the world. And obviously, we've seen a greater focus on the world's wars and the refugee crises. When I want to gauge what's on the horizon for Pope Francis, I often look at what's on the upcoming calendar for the Pontifical Academy of Sciences. This is one of the few Vatican institutions that has been very active under Pope Francis. It is run by an Argentine Archbishop, an old friend of the Pope's. Here he is, Archbishop Marcelo Sanchez. And every now and then, Pope Francis will send him a little handwritten note suggesting topics for study. This year, for example, the Academy has sponsored major events on human trafficking, on biological extinction, on the right to water, genetic biology, organ trafficking here, and transplant tourism, the health of the planet. These topics are much less theoretical than in the past. In the past, we had the Academy of Sciences looking at topics like, what is the human being, or where is the moment of death? These social justice issues are issues dear to the Pope's heart. I think they are the kind of issues that probably make Catholics say, is there a good book on that? I have no doubt that Pope Francis will continue to universalize the Church through his appointments, his documents, his meetings, his travels. He's going to show, as I told you, much greater attention to the younger demographics in the Church. Demographics is helping to drive this shift in pastoral focus coming from Rome, and I believe this opens up great new opportunities in Catholic publishing. And I'm going to stop there, and I'm happy to take any questions you may have, so I hope we can prolong the discussion.
Okay, this is Bruce back, and I would like to direct you to, on the little web, GoToWebinar control panel, there is a section for chat. It is easier, it's better to use the chat window there than the one that actually says questions. That's really meant more for some of the technical questions back and forth. But if you would use the chat, then I will follow forth and look at them and pass those on to John. as they come in, I'm going to ask John that I know that I've started reading Chris Lowney's book, Everybody Wins, on really fostering local innovation, entrepreneurship, really, in the church. And he starts with a lot of this, the same demographics, stating how, and how, in fact, the institutional church has been using these demographics and been saying there's an issue and we've got to attend to it, and then by the time the synod is over or something, they go back to the same old. And he talks about the need to do this is really from the bottom up, and we need more entrepreneurship and innovation at the local level. Do you see some of that happening, and any ideas on how we can support that?
I do. I've seen it happen. I covered the Vatican 35 years, and unfortunately, that dynamic is true. You would have major meetings in Rome, and then bishops or whoever participated would leave, and that would be the end of it. And the missing link here was, how do these things filter across to local dioceses, to local parishes? Very often, local Catholics would not even know a synod was going on. Now, that has changed somewhat under Pope Francis already, in part because the content of the synod that he called was fairly exciting and a little bit contentious, so it got more press. But I think the church still faces that issue, that it has often called communicators to Rome, for example, and they talk about ideas, and there are some great ideas that are floated around. And then the participants go home, and the United States is a big place, and maybe there are 25 participants from the United States, and it's not like they go on tour spreading the word. So I do think the church needs a way for these things to filter down more systematically. And of course, ideally, the best thing is for the ideas to filter up. That has always been the idea behind such things as synods. Probably there's already circulating a questionnaire on next year's synod on young people. And really the key to the success of that synod is going to be whether young people engage in the discussion right now, well before the bishops and other representatives go to Rome next year. So I agree with you, and I think I think too that when it comes to Catholic publishing, I've participated in so many meetings about what do we do about Catholic publishing, and much of it was because of my journalistic experience, a discussion about the health of newspapers and magazines. Everybody had ideas, but implementing them becomes much more difficult, because unless you really start locally, you can't come in with a model from outside and fix things automatically. You need energy at the local level. So I don't know if I've given you a solution to your question, but I certainly agree that sense of entrepreneurship is essential. It's going to be essential for Catholic publishers.
Sounds good. Sounds good. We have a question come up on the chat in light of the about EPUBs and in light of the 18-year-old youngers reading books on phone platform. And I found personally, if you have a doubt about that, just get a bigger phone. Galaxy Note 8 screen's very huge, great for reading. But Vince Lunetta says, do you have a view on the future of parish-based education using the phone as a platform? Do you see hymnals going away and phones up for singing?
Yes, I do. I think it will come inevitably. I think, again, all you have to do is look at any group of young people today, they are the church's future, and that's what they're using. Now, I'm not a prophet when it comes to what is going to happen in technology, but so far, for the last 10 years or so, we've seen that the cell phone is around to stay. It's just changed in size and in quality. And inevitably, I think that is going to be the medium used for not just 80% of news gathering, as it's done by young people today, but more like 90% of all communications activity done by young people. So yeah, I guess in some ways it's hard to envision a church full of people looking down at their cell phones, but you know, it's going to become less hard to envision that. I guess the key there is getting the young people into the church to begin with, because I think the real challenge is that the virtual experience of any kind of religion or spirituality is going to take place away from parish structures more and more, as we've seen. You know, only 14% of millennials right now identify as churchgoers. Millennial Catholics identify as churchgoers. So, you know, unless there's some revolution that I have a hard time envisioning, getting them into church every day for Sunday Mass may not be easy. So I think the church has to start with something else, which is reaching them where they are, which is on their cell phones.
Agreed. I'll add, in my parish, we have two big monitor screens on each side of the sanctuary, and we project some of the music up there. And what I found interesting in last Lent is they used, just for 3 minutes before Mass, they used, CRS had done a number of very short videos they'd put on YouTube, and we showed those, they showed those just before liturgy began. Fascinating, and they were excellently done videos. They were very, very engaging. That worked really good. I'll also note that I was at a symposium last year, and with the National Association of Catholic Media Professionals, and that was all about some of these future initiatives and some exciting things from some of the different dioceses that really are doing some online formation that use a mobile platform. It was very good. Any other questions, folks? Looking. Because I'll be like a, I'm going to go like a auctioneer. We'll do questions.
I wish I could end this presentation with a master plan, but unfortunately I don't have a master plan solving the challenges facing Catholic publishing. But I am encouraged by what I spoke about in the second half of my talk, which is that I still think that popes and church leaders and big church conferences are very capable of changing the agenda of interest in the Catholic Church. And I think the Church's social agenda opens up huge opportunities for engaging Catholics. And here is where I would like to see church leadership not try to direct Catholics to specific works, but to teach them how to evaluate content on their own, so that if they want to read about the church and immigration policy, you know, they'll know where to go. And that kind of direction that's offered at the local and at the universal level, I think would be invaluable.
Great. We are, I believe, coming close to our conclusion. Last chance on questions on the chat. I will remind folks as well of a couple things. As I said, when the window closes, it will probably open up a browser window with an evaluation. Please take a moment to complete that. It will help us improve. As well as the entire webinar has been recorded, and it will take a little while for the application to process that. When it is processed and completed, you will automatically receive an email that will direct you to a link to be able to view that. So great opportunity to go back to so many of these wonderful bits of information that John has shared with us that you can go back, review, take a little bit more time to go over those. And also, I'd like to direct your attention to the next in the webinar series will be Best Practices for Managing a Publisher's Social Media Content and Presence on January 10th, 2018. Again, 2 p.m. Eastern, 11 Pacific, and all through the clock in between. John, we want to thank you again for not only all the great material you shared with us today, but also your willingness to jump in. I can't believe that all of that was done in a short amount of time, but we really appreciate that.
They're interesting topics, so I'm always happy to delve in.
Great, and to everyone who has joined us, thank you. On behalf of the Association of Catholic Publishers, join us again. Thanks a lot, and we are done.